Hey everybody, this is a piece by Pierre Broué titled Trotsky, a Biographer's Problem. This is from the Trotsky Reappraisal, edited by Terry Brotherstone and Paul Dukes. This is part of my, I'm reading this as part of my research on the Trotskyist conceptions of the USSR for a master's degree. So, here we go. Trotsky, a biographer's problems. Footnote. Sorry, I gotta get to the footnotes. I don't like footnotes. You've probably heard me say that before if you've ever listened to any of my videos. The footnote says, Pierre Broué Trotsky, Paris, published in Paris, 1988. So here we go. I must begin with the sources. Many people, for the most part, were not familiar with the subject. Many people, for the most part, they were not familiar with the subject, told me that they were surprised at my attempt to write a biography of Trotsky without access to the Soviet archives. My answer was, 1, that the Trotsky papers in the Western world, particularly at Harvard, were rich and complete enough for such an attempt, and 2, that I was sure that the publication of my book would constitute an incentive for the publication of other works and eventually for the opening of the relevant Soviet archives. I want to underline, however, that I knew I was writing not the Trotsky biography, but the Trotsky biography before the complete opening of the Soviet archives. I was conscious that my work could not be definitive. I am glad, therefore, to take this chance of summing up not only my past difficulties and the gaps in my work, but also of assessing the contribution made by Soviet investigators during the last years of Glasnost. Let me first acknowledge two circumstances which have been of great help to me and have at the same time raised some serious problems. The first is the fact that Trotsky wrote his autobiography, My Life. The second is the existence of a famous biography of him, Isaac Deutscher's trilogy. On the period of Trotsky's childhood, we have, for practical purposes, various materials at our disposal: Trotsky's autobiography, the memoirs of his former friend Ziv, some chapters of Deutscher's brilliantly written first volume, and the beginning of the biography by the American Max Eastman. Footnote: Max Eastman, Leon Trotsky, The Portrait of a Youth. Published in 1925, it's a very early biography. I have been rightly criticized by Philip Pomper for not having used Eastman's archives at the University of Indiana. My only excuse is that, having written twice and received no answer at all, I did not risk a trip which could have been unfruitful. End footnote. The problem of the reliability of the autobiography is not exactly the same for Trotsky's childhood as it is for his adult political life. Trotsky, for this first period, had to rely upon his own recollections, always more or less unconsciously distorted, as we know, and impossible to check seriously against documents. Ziv had been a good friend of Trotsky, but he became, at the time of the First World War and the Revolution, his political enemy. Who is Ziv? Grishaziv? Is this who is being referred to? It looks like it is really, it is a Grisha Ziv who's being referred to, but I'm not sure. Ziv had been a good friend of Trotsky, but Ziv became, at the time of the First World War and the Revolution, Trotsky's political enemy. Ziv was very hostile when he wrote his book, as is perfectly clear to every reader. Deutscher, using the technique of a good novelist, borrowed material from Ziv and used it purged of the worst signs of this hostility. Fortunately, Max Eastman interviewed Trotsky during the early 1930s and visited people who knew him as a boy. The Spencer cousins, at least one of his fellow students and some of his first comrades in arms in the Underground Union for the Liberation of the Working Class. In my work, I did my best not to fall into the traps of self-justification, political enmity, and even literary talent set by my sources. I tried to arrive at a balanced assessment. It is improbable that Soviet archives will be of much help for the period of Trotsky's childhood. Today it is not as important as it was in the 1930s and during the Stalin era to know that Trotsky's father was a, quote, kulak and a, quote, oppressor, employing wage labor, and his second wife, Natalia Sedova, was born into the nobility. Yet these two facts still seemed very important in 1987 to one of the specialists in the struggle against Trotskyism, Professor V.M. Ivanov. I don't see anything for V.M. Ivanov. Back to the text. The problem of the sources takes a different form for the next period, the pre-revolutionary period. There remains the autobiography. There are a small number of memoirs of contemporary co-workers, but there is now the important contribution of Natalia Ivanovna Sedova to Victor Serge's The Life and Death of Leon Trotsky. In addition, we have at our disposal the bulk of Trotsky's writings, articles, and pamphlets in 1914, either in the original papers and magazines or in his complete works published in the Soviet Union, and his speeches at the Congress of the International or to the Russian Party. But we do not have access to any archives, correspondence, or contemporary manuscripts. This lacuna is all the more important since it was the third period. It was this period that Stalin used extensively to get ammunition with which to discredit Trotsky and present Trotsky as a, quote, anti-Leninist. Professor V.M. Ivanov found here the substance of his main slanders in the article already mentioned. The term, quote, little Judas, Yudushka, applied to Trotsky by Lenin, was written during their violent quarrel about Lenin's use of the name of the Pravda of Vienna, edited by Trotsky for his newspaper in Petrograd. For Trotsky's biographer, the more striking feature of this period is his constant striving at any price for conciliation and for the unity of the Russian Party. For Trotsky at that time, Lenin was sectarian and even secessionist, fully responsible for the party's split. The outcome of this line was the constitution of the 1912 August Bloc. In practice, the regroupment of every current of the party against Lenin and several so-called party Mensheviks. Curiously enough, the, quote, conciliationist Trotsky is very sharp in his polemics. The pamphlet Report of the Siberian Delegation of 1903 and Our Political Tasks of 1904 are written in a needlessly aggressive tone, not really suitable for a conciliator, and some of the best-known evaluations by Trotsky of Lenin's policy are greatly exaggerated. At the time of Our Political Tasks, the dictatorship of Lenin did not involve the expulsion of opponents, far less their assassination. There is here a surprising discordance between what we know of Trotsky's ends and the means he employed. We may say something similar about the fact that, in the 1907 Congress, Lenin's proposal to discuss, quote, the present moment in the revolution, end quote, was defeated by the Mensheviks with Trotsky's help. Did he believe that a practical step toward reunification was more important than a theoretical debate about, quote, permanent revolution? We do not know, and to this day there has been no satisfactory answer. Writing these chapters of the biography, I gained a sense of the international importance of Trotsky. Very well known in the international and even in the world press, and probably more important than Lenin in the eyes of many observers. To this day, no inkling of this has been given in the Soviet historical literature. In the Sovietology of the Cold War period, which Stephen Cohen calls, quote, counter-communist, end quote, great use was made of Trotsky's attacks to discredit Lenin, while the Stalinists used Lenin's attacks to discredit Trotsky. But in more recent years, these episodes of the pre-revolutionary period have not attracted the attention of Soviet historians. I came to the conclusion that Trotsky was right in his explanations concerning his own position on the October uprising. He was not opposed to it, as Lenin believed for a while, and as was repeated later ad nauseum by the Stalinists. He favored coordinating the uprising with the meeting of the Congress of Soviets, because Trotsky thought that the uprising ought to be carried out in the name of the Soviets. Such an interpretation seems to be far from the conception of present Soviet historians. Yuri Afanasyev himself repeats the Stalinist interpretation that Trotsky was hostile to the uprising. Wikipedia says Yuri Afanasyev lived from 1934 to 2015. Yuri Afanasyev was a Soviet-Russian historian, one of the leaders of Russia's democratic movement in the late 1980s, early 1990s. He was also the rector of the Moscow Institute of History and Archives, which he transformed in 1991 into the Russian State University of Humanities, and led until 2003, making it into one of Russia's most internationally prominent educational institutions. Back to the text. Such an interpretation seems to be far from the conception of present Soviet historians. Yuri Afanasyev himself repeats the Stalinist interpretation that Trotsky was hostile to the uprising. Western historiography in general understood long ago that the main event of the year 1917 was the coming together of Lenin and Trotsky under the pressure of the war and the revolution, which they interpreted in the same way and tried together to resolve by demanding, quote, all power to the Soviets. Even now, I find in the new Soviet historiography no consciousness of such a coming together, nor does there seem to be an awareness of the extraordinary variety of the currents which constituted the rejuvenated Bolshevism of 1917. Finally, I've been told that the first Trotsky archives confiscated by the Austrian police in Vienna in 1914 and returned to Trotsky during the Brest-Litovsk negotiations as a diplomatic gesture have recently been located in Moscow. If this is true, it will be very helpful in the completion of this part of the biography. Perhaps we will be able to answer the as yet unanswered questions. We now come to the most studied period, from the revolution to Trotsky's expulsion from the USSR. Too often studies of these years have been made by journalists or politicians in search of analogies, precedents, and illustrations for present political ends. In effect, this is the only period seriously studied in the Soviet Union recently. It is a period all too briefly reported in the autobiography, and one which Deutscher is too inclined to interpret in the light of his own conceptions. In sum, there remain many open questions about the role of Trotsky during these years. We have at our disposal not only My Life, Deutscher's second volume, and Natalia's Recollections, but also the Trotsky archives in Harvard, official party documents, circulars, Central Committee minutes, text of speeches and reports, declarations of the left opposition, part of the correspondence between the oppositionists, etc., mainly, however, public rather than personal documents. Let me begin with the basic discussion. Was the conflict between Stalin and Trotsky, or as I prefer, between the apparatus and the bureaucracy, one side and the left opposition on the other, a conflict of ideas and of social contradictions? Or was it the struggle between two would-be oppressors and hangmen, two, quote, bears, equally ruthless towards ordinary Soviet people? For years, Western, quote, counter-communist, end quote, Sovietology defended the second interpretation, presented as the, quote, struggle for power, end quote, the, quote, succession war, end quote, etc. And the great majority of recent writers in the Soviet Union seem to have adhered to this counter-communist point of view. For the first time since before the period of Stalin's distortions, the Brest-Litovsk peace negotiations have been presented without distortions and slanders. By the historian A.V. Pantsov, I think Pantsov might be an important character. Does he write about like China and shit too? Yeah, I don't know. Not finding like a good snappy description of him, but he does have a couple of books on China. Back to the text. And Vysetsky's work on Trotsky and foreign affairs gives the latter's interpretation of his own positions during the Brest debate. Several military historians are at work on the topic of Trotsky and the Civil War. Volkogonov has already published extracts entitled Trotsky at the Front, where the commander, first of the Red Guards, then of the Red Army, is properly portrayed. The Kronstadt Rising is often evoked as one of the biggest crimes of Bolshevism, but without any explanation. For instance, nothing has been produced to confront the current anarchist/counter-communist interpretation in the West, which makes Trotsky principally, if not solely, responsible for a repression he did not lead. For some, Makhno's rehabilitation has been an occasion for new attacks on Trotsky, putting on his shoulders the responsibility for the armed struggle against the anarchist partisans in Ukraine. Like Stalin in the past, many authors today make use of the militarization of the unions to depict Trotsky as the, quote, patriarch of the bureaucrats, end quote. Or, to use the more fashionable phrase, as the theoretician of, quote, barrack socialism, end quote. To this end, some authors make great use of his own, quote, terrorist utterances of the period of the Civil War, a period during which Trotsky exaggerated once more, not only in the tone but even in the content of his fighting speeches. In my Trotsky biography, I explain at length the Pantelev case, involving the communist commissar who was summarily tried before Kazan by a military court on Trotsky's orders. I don't see anything for Pantelev that I can quickly read from. He was sentenced, Pantelev was sentenced to death and shot for having fled with some of his panic-stricken soldiers. Such an episode, of which plenty are to be found in every war, and which are settled sometimes with more ruthlessly than this one was by Trotsky, was the center of the attacks against Trotsky's behavior as the head of the Red Army during the Civil War. Today the same tales are repeated without adding anything new. Leningrad historian V.I. Bilek notes that Stalin would have publicized other episodes if they had happened, or if some documents in the archives suggested that they might have happened. Discussion of the Civil War and the trade union question gives ammunition for an offensive against Trotsky, notably by Stalin's new biographer, General Volkogonov. The theory according to which Trotsky and Stalin were two rival wild beasts is useful for historians serving those in power. The establishment of equivalence between Stalinism and Trotskyism aids the idea of a continuity from Bolshevism and Leninism to Stalinism and strengthens a regime which fears revolutionary sentiments. Moreover, the struggle of opposites loses interest if it results merely from personal rivalries, with ideas reduced to the cover for such rivalries. From this point of view, Soviet rewriting of this history up to now has only reinforced the central theme of counter-communism. Fortunately, there are other sides to the story. For instance, an interview in Pravda by historians Zhuravlev and Nenarakov brought a glaring confirmation of what Trotsky had already asserted concerning the Georgian case in 1922, namely Lenin's sympathetic attitude, and his proposal to Trotsky of a bloc against Stalin in defense of the Georgians. The Letter of 46, on the 15th of October 1943, which began the debate, has now been published. Articles and documents by A.M. Podgolden about the 1923 crisis illustrate accurately the nature of the debate on the new course, which was a conflict between party bureaucracy and democracy. We have also learnt that the results of the votes in the Moscow organization, decisive for the general vote in the party, were in favor of the opposition and were deliberately falsified by the apparatus. Anton Antonov of Senko, using the testimony of one of his father's aide-de-camp, tells us that several military commanders, Antonov himself and Muralov, as well as the Chekist Sint-Adza, suggested to Trotsky a limited military coup, which they could have accomplished, and the aim of which would have been to sweep away Stalin's clique and restore party democracy. Anton Antonov of Senko lived from 1920 to 2013 and was a Russian historian and writer. Born on the 23rd of February 1920, he was the son of Bolshevik military leader Vladimir Antonov of Senko, who commanded the assault on the Winter Palace. In 1923, he signed the Declaration of 46. In 1935, he joined the historical faculty of the Moscow State Pedagogical Institute. In 1938, he was expelled from the Komsomol and the institute, wherein, however, he was reinstated in the same year. Anton Antonov of Senko was arrested in 1940 and spent 13 years in labor camps. Antonov of Senko is best known for his biography of Leventi Beria, and he also wrote several books. Antonov of Senko operated a state museum on the Gulag, for which the Moscow administration provided a building in August 2001. When he died in 2013, he was still working 2 full days a week to continue documenting what he called, quote, the evils of the Soviet era, end quote, and to help with plans for a new, larger space. And his father was Vladimir Alexandrovich Antonov of Senko, who lived from 1883 to 1938. His real name, Ovsenko, party aliases Bayonet and Nikita, literary pseudonym of A. Galsky, was a prominent Bolshevik leader, Soviet statesman, military commander, and diplomat. And Wikipedia says the Declaration of 46 was a secret letter sent by a group of 46 leading Soviet communists to the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on the 15th of October 1923. The declaration followed Trotsky's letter, which was sent to the Politburo on the 8th of October and expressed similar concerns, and thus laying the foundation for the left opposition within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Later that year, signatories had pointed to issues with the party ban and also called for a review of the factional ban introduced in the 10th Congress through a party conference. The vast majority of the signatories were executed before the Great Purge. Also wanted to look up Muralov, Bolshevik. Nikolai Muralov lived from 1877 to 1937 and was a Bolshevik revolutionary leader and military commander in Russia, who after 1923 became a member of the left opposition. Muralov was a direct participant in both the Revolution of 1905 and the October Revolution of 1917. A personal friend of Leon Trotsky, Muralov was arrested in 1936 during the Great Terror and was a defendant in the so-called Trial of the 17 in January 1937, after which he was executed. The official Soviet reckoning of Muralov was softened during the 1960s, and he was afforded a full posthumous rehabilitation in 1986. And Wikipedia says Kota Tsyntsadze lived from 1887 to 1930 and was a Georgian Bolshevik who was the first chairman of the Georgian Cheka and involved in the Russian revolutions and the Sovietization of Georgia. Tsyntsadze was purged under Joseph Stalin as a member of the left opposition within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Back to the text. I'm going to reread that last sentence. Antonov Ovchinko, using the testimony of one of his father's aides-de-camp, tells us that several military commanders, Antonov himself, his father Vladimir Antonov, and Muralov, as well as the Chekist Tsyntsadze, suggested to Trotsky a limited military coup, which they could have accomplished, and the aim of which would have been to sweep away Stalin's clique and restore party democracy, but Trotsky was opposed to the use of force and of illegal means inside the party. Concerning Trotsky's absence at Lenin's funeral, the same Antonov Ovchinko tells us that in archives in Moscow, he was able to read correspondence between Stalin and the secretary of the Abkhazian party, Nestor Lakoba, reflecting the efforts of Stalin to induce Lakoba to keep Trotsky in Sukhumi. Wikipedia says Nestor Lakoba lived from 1893 to 1936 and was an Abkhaz communist leader. Nestor Lakoba helped establish Bolshevik power in Abkhazia in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution and served as the head of Abkhazia after its conquest by the Bolshevik Red Army in 1921. While in power, Nestor Lakoba saw that Abkhazia was initially given autonomy within the USSR as the Socialist Soviet Republic of Abkhazia, though nominally a part of the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic with a special status of, quote, Union Republic. The Abkhaz SSR was effectively a separate republic, made possible by Lakoba's close relationship with Joseph Stalin. Lakoba successfully opposed the extension of collectivization of Abkhazia though in return Lakoba was forced to accept a downgrade of Abkhazia's status to that of an autonomous republic within the Georgian SSR. Popular in Abkhazia due to his ability to resonate with the people, Nestor Lakoba maintained a close relationship with Stalin, who would frequently holiday in Abkhazia during the 1920s and 1930s. The relationship saw Lakoba become the rival of one of Stalin's other confidants, Lavrenti Beria, who was in charge of the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, which included Georgia. During a visit to Beria in Tbilisi in December 1936, Nestor Lakoba was poisoned, allowing Beria to consolidate his control of Abkhazia and all of Georgia, and to discredit Lakoba and his family as enemies of the state. Rehabilitated after the death of Stalin, Nestor Lakoba is now revered as a national hero in Abkhazia. Back to the text. Concerning Trotsky's absence at Lenin's funeral, the same Antonov Ovsenko tells us that in archives in Moscow, he was able to read correspondence between Stalin and the secretary of the Abkhazian Party, Nestor Lakoba, reflecting the efforts of Stalin to induce Lakoba to keep Trotsky in Sukhumi. About the literary discussion opened up around Lessons of October, Krupskaya's correspondence shows clearly that Trotsky was right when he wrote that his preface was only a pretext for an attack against him, long before decided by the triumvirate of Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev. Everybody, including myself, used to believe that Trotsky abstained during the discussion about the fate of Lenin's testament. We know now that he voted in the Politburo in favor of its publication inside the party, and that his abstention in the Central Committee was only the effect of the discipline he observed at that time in respect of decisions of the higher organ of the party. The publication, for the first time in the Soviet Union, of Our Differences, written in December 1924, shows the real motivation of Trotsky, who abstained from any gesture which could be interpreted as pursuing personal motives, and who was prepared to wait long enough to reveal the real motivation of his adversaries and the social forces supporting them. Apart from the routine estimation by M.S. Gorbachev of Trotsky's alliance with Zinoviev and Kamenev, nothing new has emerged to illuminate its making, except some details about differences inside the Zinovievist current in a work by Vazetsky. We still lack elementary information on the differences between the leaders of the United Opposition, which seriously weakened their coalition from the beginning. We also lack such information about the differences inside the leadership, which were expressed in the open clash during the Central Committee of August 1927 between Stalin and Ordzhonikidze. We have nothing at all on Stalin's use of GPU provocation in the case of Wrangel's officer, whose real name is still secret. We know that two sets at least of the left opposition's archives, prepared and classified by Trotsky's collaborators, were hidden for years before being finally discovered. One in the Marx Engels Institute, where they had been entrusted to Ryazanov, and other in Smolensk, about which I have been informed by Viktor Dalin through Miklos Kuhn. I'm going to look these names up. It looks like Miklos Kuhn. I'm not really finding a real good description of him, but he's a historian from Hungary. It's Victor Dalin. not really seeing anything. So, back to the text. I personally think that historians today will get much more information about political developments at the end of the 1920s from the KGB and Stalin archives than from party ones. Trotsky's working hypothesis, that of the existence and development after Lenin's death of a bureaucracy whose political power was invested in the apparatus and then taken over by Stalin personally, gave a vital theoretical lead. But while there has been a debate between sociologists about the bureaucracy, with the participation of one historian, no real debate between historians on this specific theme has taken place. Among Mikhail Gefter's many illuminating remarks, I wish to mention one about the fact that Stalinism was not, properly speaking, a necessity in 1923, but that Stalin made it more and more necessary by a deliberate policy in the following years. Mikhail Gefter was born in 1918 in Simferopol, Crimea, in a Jewish family. Where am I? He wrote a book. This Mikhail Gefter wrote a book titled Jews in the Red Army, 1941 to 1945. Yeah. Mikhail Gefter also reached a sort of belated and unconscious agreement with Trotsky. The latter speaks of a, quote, preventative civil war, end quote, on the part of Stalin and his apparatus, whereas Mikhail Gefter speaks of a, quote, uses the term, quote, permanent civil war. Ideas are not lacking to fuel this debate. What is badly needed is new archival material. For the last period of Trotsky's life, Trotsky's final exile, we have access to all the information possible about Trotsky's personal life and personal intervention in the political field thanks to the Harvard, Amsterdam, and Stanford archives. We also have the testimonies of his collaborators in exile. There are, however, numerous pages in the history of Trotsky in the Soviet Union. For example, when Pods Olden and Alina Kotelenets tried to give a popular summary of Trotsky's real history, they had to reduce the exile to some dates and an account of Trotsky's murder. Look at that. It just looks like she's a historian. Elena Kotelenets is a historian in Russia. There are, however, numerous gaps in the history of Trotsky in the Soviet Union. For example, when Paj Olden and Elena Kotelenets tried to give a popular summary of Trotsky's real history, they had to reduce the exile to some dates and an account of Trotsky's murder. If something new is to be written on the blank pages of Soviet history at that time, even well-worked Trotsky archives could gain a new value. Despite great quantity of new materials brought to light in recent years in the Soviet Union, the use being made of them remains disappointingly unbalanced. At last we have good information about the Ryutin case and his arrest in 1932. Before now, we only knew the content of rumors circulating in Moscow through Nikolevsky, Victor Serge, and Sadov's correspondence. We now know who constituted the Ryutin group, which won over several real Trotskyists. Despite Trotsky's denial. We are also able to read some of the programmatic texts of the group and extracts from the others. We also have some scraps of information concerning what happened behind the scenes of the Moscow trials. For instance, we know that Rakovsky, Trotsky's friend, who was sentenced to prison in 1938, was finally shot in September 1941 in the prison of Orel, together with others. We know that his friend Sosnovsky, who capitulated in 1934 with Rakovsky, was broken through interrogation, but he confessed and denounced some of the defendants who were later shot. Looking up Sosnovsky. Lev Sosnovsky lived from 1886 to 1937. Lev Sosnovsky was a Russian revolutionary publicist and journalist. Lev Sosnovsky was a prominent Trotskyist and member of the left opposition who was executed for his opposition to Joseph Stalin during the Great Purge. Back to the text, we know that Trotsky's friend Sosnovsky, who capitulated in 1934 with Rakovsky, was broken through interrogation, that he confessed and denounced some of the defendants who were later shot, but the GPU was not able to put Sosnovsky on display in a public trial, and Sosnovsky had to be shot before it. Among the few old Bolsheviks who did not yield under torture and were shot, two were former members of the United Opposition, the Left Opposition, and finally the Opposition Bloc, E.A. Preobrazhensky and I.T. Smilga. N.A. Vazetsky, who is, in effect, an official historian for the Central Committee, was the first to confess that Trotsky's murder by Mercader had been ordered by Stalin in person and carefully prepared. Such a confession does not add much to our knowledge, but takes on a certain importance after 50 years of official denial. The curious article in Moscow News, according to which Trotsky and Mercader were both Stalin's victims, may perhaps be explained, psychoanalytically, by the fact that the author's father worked for Stalin's Action Service. One second, sorry. It must be said, then, that for the period of Trotsky's exile, we still have too many blank pages. Far more pages are still blank, indeed, than those which have recently been filled in. The problem of the opposition bloc of 1932 has been left untouched, despite the discovery of several conclusive documents in the Harvard and Stanford archives. We have not heard of any attempt to explain Stalin's famous cable on, quote, the 4 years of delay, end quote, of the GPU in 1936, or the testimony of Safarov at the first Zinoviev trial on the semi-public activity of the bloc, which corroborates all the information found in Trotsky's and Sadov's archives. Wikipedia says Georgy Safarov lived from 1891 to 1942. Georgy Safarov was a Bolshevik revolutionary and politician who was a participant in the Russian Revolution, the Russian Civil War, and in the executions of the Romanovs in Yekaterinburg and Alapyevsk. Later, Georgy Safarov was arrested for his association with the left opposition and served as an NKVD informant in prison and gave fabricated evidence against over 100 of his former comrades, in spite of which Georgy Safarov was executed on the 27th of July, 1942. God, what an embarrassing end. He's one of only a few victims of Joseph Stalin's purges not posthumously rehabilitated or reinstated to the party after his death, when the history of the 1930s was re-examined in the 1980s. I wonder if that's because he fucking ratted so many people out. Or not even ratted, fucking was straight up an informant. That's even more so than being a rat, I think. Well, I don't know. I guess that is what a rat is. What's the difference between a rat and a snitch? I guess a rat, if you're thinking of like Leonardo DiCaprio's character in fucking The Departed, I guess is someone who is an informant. Or not an informant, but like a undercover. An informant, is that a snitch? I guess so. I don't know. Back to the text. Does Zinoviev's trial have a special Wikipedia? Let's see. I don't see anything for that. No. So I'll repeat that last sentence. We have not heard of any attempt to explain Stalin's famous cable on the, quote, 4 years of delay of the GPU in 1936. Or the testimony of Safarov at the first Zinoviev trial. Son of a bitch. Where am I? Okay, I'm not seeing anything for that. Sorry. I accidentally fucking clicked out of the page, out of the PDF I'm reading from. Where am I? We have not heard of any attempt to explain Stalin's famous cable on the, quote, 4 years of delay of the GPU in 1936, or the testimony of Safarov at the first Zinoviev trial on the semi-public activity of the bloc, which corroborates all the information found in Trotsky's and Sadov's archives. There's been no study of Ivan Nikitich Smirnov, the key man of the bloc, the circumstances of his arrest, or his confession on the eve of his trial after months of resistance. We await patiently the Saratov University edition of the complete minutes of the first Moscow trial, in which I have written a paper titled Trotsky and the First Moscow Trial, which includes all we know about the bloc. Again, we have to remember that this piece is from 1992. Footnote. See Pierre Broué's party opposition to Stalin, 1930-32, and the First Moscow Trial, published in the book Essays on Revolutionary Culture and Stalinism, edited by J.W. Strong, published in 1990. Let me read this thing. It doesn't seem to have a description. What it does have is a table of contents. So let's read the table of contents. Richard Steitz, Festival and Revolution, the Role of Public Spectacle in Russia, 1917 to 1918. Gabriela Gortska, Proletarian Culture and Practice, Workers' Clubs, 1917 to 1921. Felix Patrikhev, Russian and Soviet Economic Penetration of Northeastern China, 1895 to 1933. Ben-Sion Pinchuk, Sovietization of the Shtetl of Eastern Poland, 1939 to 41. Michal Reimann, The Russian Revolution and Stalinism, A Political Problem and Its Historiographic Content. Pierre Broué, Party Opposition to Stalin, 1930 to 1932, and the First Moscow Trial. Grima Gil, Stalinism and Institutionalization, The Nature of Stalin's Regional Support. Niels E. Rosenfeld, Stalinism as a System of Communication. It's either Michael or Michael Gelb, Mass Politics Under Stalinism, 2 case studies. William Chase and J. Arch Getty, The Soviet Bureaucracy in 1935, A Socio-Political Profile, and Roberta T. Manning, Peasants and Party, Rural Administration in the Soviet Countryside on the Eve of World War II. Back to the text and footnote. For the first time since Khrushchev's famous speech at the 22nd Congress, it has been stated publicly in the Soviet Union that Kirov was killed on Stalin's orders. According to Wikipedia, the 22nd Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was held from the 17th to the 31st of October 1961 in 14 days of sessions. 22nd of October was a day off. 4,413 delegates, in addition to delegates from 83 foreign communist parties, listened to Nikita Khrushchev and others review policy issues. At the Congress, the Sino-Soviet split hardened, especially due to Soviet de-Stalinization efforts, and it was the last Congress to be attended by the Chinese Communist Party. The Congress elected the 22nd Central Committee. Back to the text. I'm going to repeat the last sentence I said. For the first time since Khrushchev's famous speech at the 22nd Congress, it has been stated publicly in the Soviet Union that Kirov was killed on Stalin's orders. The documents of the investigation commission seem to have been more or less put into limited circulation, but many problems remain. Who was the important person at the top who used Dr. Levin to contact Sadov and inform himself about Trotsky's intentions? Kirov, it is widely supposed, but not Ordzhonikidze, whose death in 1937 was no accident? But why not Ordzhonikidze, whose death in 1937 was no accident? Sorry, I was looking up to see if there was a Dr. Levin. What about the ferocious struggle at the top in 1936 at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, when Karl Radek, who had no importance of his own, was able to criticize openly the non-intervention policy and explain that the revolution in Spain spelt danger for the British imperialists? Every foreign diplomat in Moscow at that time saw a crisis about which nobody speaks today. We badly need more information on the political life of the USSR than we have at our disposal if we were to sketch in the new periodization suggested by Gefter. It is quite possible, even highly probable, that the necessary documents are kept carefully under lock and key in the KGB and Stalin archives. The explanation for many mysteries can no doubt be found there, such as the open opposition of people like Piatnitsky, the murders ordered by Stalin in Spain, the cases of Landau, Berneri, about which what we already knew has been published in the USSR, and above all Nin, the trial of the Soviet Union of the last Trotskyists accused of a plot in the prisons, and also the circumstances of the preparation of Trotsky's murder, about which also nothing has been revealed which was not already known in the West. Wikipedia says Osip Piatnitsky lived from 1882 to 1938. Osip Piatnitsky was a Russian revolutionary and Soviet politician. Osip Piatnitsky is best remembered as head of the International Department of the Communist International during the 1920s and early 1930s, a position which made him one of the leading public faces of the international communist movement. Landau? Is it Kurt Landau? It is Kurt Landau. Wikipedia says Kurt Landau lived from 1903 to 1937. Kurt Landau was an Austrian communist, member of the International Left Opposition, author and Trotskyist. Kurt Landau was murdered by agents of Stalin's NKVD during the Spanish Civil War. And Berneri, communist. I don't know. Okay, this might be who I'm looking for. Yeah, I'm not saying anything. Actually, never mind. To conclude, this is back to the text. To conclude, I started by saying that I was conscious of having only produced the biography of Trotsky, which could be written on the basis of archives in the Western world, and that we had to look for a new biography on the basis of the Soviet archives. 3 years after the publication of my book, 6 years after the beginning of Perestroika and Glasnost, it seems that we must still look for the first real sign of a willingness of those in power to help in the creation of a scientific history by opening the archives, particularly the KGB and Stalin collections, to scholars independently of their political views. The fate of history in the Soviet Union is closely linked to the political battle waged in that country. It depends on the outcome of that struggle. That's the end of this piece. Thank you so much for listening.